The courtroom was quiet except for the sound of papers being shuffled. A man named David sat at the defendant's table, his hands folded tightly together, as if holding on to the last bit of strength he had. His dark eyes looked tired, not from lack of sleep, but from weeks of stress and fear. He wasn't used to being in a place like this. He had spent most of his life working with his hands, building things, fixing things, doing honest work. Now he was sitting in front of a judge, accused of stealing from the same company he had given 15 years of his life to. People from town filled the seats behind him. Some knew him well, others came out of curiosity. In a small community like theirs, news spread fast, especially when it involved someone everyone thought was good. David had worked for the local construction company since his 20s. He showed up early, left late, and never once had trouble with anyone. That's why when the company manager accused him of theft, the whole town was stunned. The prosecutor stood tall, his voice confident, as he explained to the jury how David had supposedly taken expensive tools from the company's storage room and hidden them in his own locker. He painted a picture of betrayal, a trusted worker who had secretly been stealing from his employer. David didn't move. He stared straight ahead, trying to keep his emotions in check. His lawyer, a young woman named Rachel, sat beside him. She leaned over and whispered that everything would be fine, but even she didn't sound sure. The judge, an older man with glasses slipping down his nose, looked tired of the whole thing. He had seen plenty of cases, but something about this one seemed to weigh on him. Maybe it was the way David sat there, calm but broken, or the way his grown son and daughter sat behind him, their faces pale and worried. David had always been proud of his work. After his wife passed away years earlier, his job had become his lifeline. He worked overtime to make sure his children had food, school supplies, and a warm home. He wasn't rich, but he was proud. Every nail he hammered and every wall he built meant something. He built homes for others while slowly rebuilding his own life after loss. Now everything was falling apart because of something he didn't do. When the prosecutor held up photos of the stolen tools found in David's locker, a heavy silence filled the room. The pictures were clear, showing the company's stamp and serial numbers. David's lawyer stood up and objected, saying they needed proof of who put them there, but the judge allowed the photos into evidence. David's breathing grew shallow. He remembered the day police came to his home. They had knocked early in the morning, waking his son and daughter. Neighbors peeked through their windows as officers led him to the car. No one said anything, but the looks were enough. Shame spread through him, even though he knew he was innocent. Back in the courtroom, David sat still, but inside he was breaking. The prosecutor's words hit like stones. Every sentence made him feel smaller. The manager who had accused him sat near the front, arms crossed, wearing a smug smile. David had worked under that man for years. There had always been tension between them, quiet comments, little jokes about David being lucky to have such a steady job. He ignored them because he needed the paycheck and didn't want trouble. Now the same man was sitting there watching him suffer. Rachel stood and began her cross-examination. Her voice was steady but calm, asking questions about the companies, security cameras, about who had access to the storage room, and about why only David's locker had been checked. The manager's answers were short and defensive. He claimed he received a tip that led him to search David's things. But when asked who gave the tip, he said he couldn't remember. The judge raised an eyebrow. Even the jury looked confused. Rachel pushed further, but the prosecutor objected, saying the witness didn't have to reveal his source. The objection was sustained. Rachel sat down slowly, frustration on her face. David didn't say a word. He couldn't. The weight in his chest was too heavy. When the court broke for lunch, David stayed seated. He didn't feel like eating. His daughter, a quiet young woman in her early 20s, walked over and placed her hand on his shoulder. She whispered that she believed him. That was all he needed to hear. Her words gave him a small piece of strength to hold on to. When the trial resumed, the prosecutor continued to describe David as a man who had fallen on hard times and had taken what he thought he deserved. David felt the sting of every word. He wanted to shout that it wasn't true, that he'd never stolen a thing in his life, but his lawyer told him to stay calm, to let the process play out. Then came the moment that broke him. The prosecutor held up a timesheet showing David had worked late the night the theft supposedly happened. He said it was proof David had stayed behind to steal. But David knew the truth. He had been fixing a broken door on the storage shed because the lock was faulty. He had told the manager about it, and the man had thanked him. Now that same act of kindness was being used against him. Tears filled his eyes before he could stop them. He covered his face with both hands and tried to hide his trembling shoulders. The courtroom went completely silent. Even the prosecutor stopped talking for a moment. People in the seats shifted uncomfortably. They weren't used to seeing a grown man cry, especially someone like David, quiet, strong, and always composed. It wasn't the tears of guilt. It was the heartbreak of being accused of something so cruelly unfair. Years of hard work, respect, and pride were being torn apart in front of everyone. He could feel the weight of judgment from the people behind him, some who had once smiled at him on the street now whispering to each other. The judge looked down at him, his expression softening. He called for a short recess. David stayed seated, trying to regain control. His lawyer handed him a tissue and he nodded without speaking. He could barely breathe. Rachel leaned closer and told him she believed him. She promised they would find the truth. But deep down, David was losing hope. The system didn't seem built for men like him, men who worked hard, stayed quiet, and trusted that fairness would come naturally. Outside the courtroom, the air felt heavy. Reporters waited by the steps, taking photos and shouting questions. David's son helped him walk past them without answering. They got into an old pickup truck and sat in silence for a long time. His son finally said that everything would come to light, that people couldn't hide the truth forever. David nodded but didn't speak. His heart ached from more than just fear. It hurt because he felt invisible, like all his years of good work had meant nothing in the face of one man's accusation. That night he barely slept. He sat at his kitchen table staring at an old photograph of his wife. Her smile seemed to remind him that good people had to endure pain sometimes. He whispered to her memory that he hadn't done anything wrong, and that he would fight until his name was cleared. The next morning he returned to court, dressed in the same worn suit he had worn at every hearing. People still filled the benches. Some avoided his eyes. Others gave small nods of support. When he sat down, he noticed the janitor from the company sitting quietly in the back row. He didn't know why the man was there, but he gave him a small nod. As the judge called the session to order, David took a deep breath. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room. He was tired, but he wasn't ready to give up. He didn't know what was coming next, or no one did. But something in the air felt different that morning. He didn't know that the truth was already starting to move toward him in ways he couldn't yet see. David sat back in the courtroom, trying to gather his thoughts as the second day of the trial began. The previous day had been crushing. His tears had made everyone pause, but nothing had changed yet. Today felt heavier. He had learned long ago that life didn't stop for unfairness, and neither could he. His lawyer, Rachel, leaned over and whispered that they had a few new leads to follow, small things that could turn the case around. It was enough to keep him going, though a flicker of doubt lingered in his mind. The courtroom slowly filled. People who had avoided him yesterday were here today, either out of curiosity or a growing sense that the story wasn't as simple as they had thought. His children sat quietly behind him, trying to offer support without drawing attention. David's son had grown tall like his father, and his daughter had inherited the calm patience that David himself carried. They watched their father's every movement, knowing he was trying to hold himself together for them. The prosecutor started by repeating the accusations, his voice steady, but more guarded than yesterday. He laid out the timeline of the alleged theft and showed receipts and records claiming that David had been involved. Every piece of evidence was meant to paint him as guilty. But David had spent his life building a careful reputation, and he knew that most people who knew him could see the truth if it was shown clearly. Rachel asked for permission to question some of the employees who had been around the storage area that night. The judge nodded, and one by one witnesses came forward. Each gave statements, some saying they hadn't noticed anything unusual. Some admitted they had seen David in the storage area, but only doing his normal work, fixing doors, moving heavy items, or organizing materials. Nothing suspicious. The tension in the courtroom built as Rachel asked simple, straightforward questions. Who had access to the storage room? Who else knew about the tools? And who had keys? The manager who accused David sat stiffly, answering with short, defensive replies. He avoided eye contact with the jury, and a few jurors frowned as they whispered to each other. Something about his story wasn't adding up, but no one could say for sure yet. David felt the pressure in every nerve of his body. He was used to doing physical labor, not defending himself in front of strangers. He had learned to solve problems with his hands, not words. But now words were everything, and he had to rely on Rachel to tell his side. Still, every time the prosecutor said something unfair or twisted, David's heart sank. He remembered how he had spent countless nights worrying about his children's future, and now he was worried that even the truth might not be enough to protect it. During a short break, David stepped outside into the bright morning sun. The air felt strange on his skin, almost too real compared to the artificial tension inside the courthouse. He leaned against a railing, trying to let the light fill him with some hope. His daughter came out to join him, carrying a small bottle of water. She didn't say much. She just handed it to him and nodded, as if telling him without words that she trusted him. When court resumed, an unexpected witness came forward, a janitor from the company. He was a quiet man, older and often overlooked, but he had spent decades walking through the halls and seeing things no one else noticed. He spoke slowly, carefully, as if measuring every word. He said he had been cleaning the storage area the night the tools were supposedly taken, and had seen someone near David's locker who shouldn't have been there. The courtroom hushed. Every eye turned to the janitor. He continued, explaining that he had watched the figure put something into the locker and then leave quickly. He hadn't recognized the face at the time because it was dark, but he had remembered the unusual movements. He had come forward now because he couldn't let an innocent man be punished. The judge asked the janitor if he could identify the person, and the man hesitated. He admitted he wasn't sure, but he had a feeling it was someone from management, someone who had access and motive. The courtroom murmured again, and the manager who accused David shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The tension in the air grew thicker, heavier. Rachel asked the janitor if he had any proof. The man nodded and reached into his pocket. He pulled out an old phone, the kind with a tiny camera, and handed it to the court officer. The screen showed a short video, grainy but enough to see movement near the lockers. It wasn't clear enough to identify anyone at first glance, but it was enough to raise serious questions. David felt his stomach tighten as the prosecutor tried to dismiss the video as inconclusive, but the judge allowed it to be played for the jury. As the small screen flickered with the shaky footage, the room felt as if it had taken a deep breath. People leaned forward, trying to see more clearly. David held his hands together, his knuckles white, as a small spark of hope began to flicker. The video showed the figure moving quickly, glancing around nervously, and then slipping an object into a locker. It was short, just a few seconds, but the gesture was unmistakable. Rachel paused the footage and asked the jury to notice the hesitation, the careful steps, and the way the figure seemed to be avoiding detection. "This isn't the work of a loyal employee," she said. "It's the work of someone covering up their own mistake." David's heart pounded. He had hoped someone would see the truth, but now, watching this evidence play out in court, it felt almost surreal. The proof that had been hidden for so long was finally making its way into the open. He looked at the jurors, seeing curiosity, concern, and finally, doubt beginning to replace certainty. The prosecutor tried to regain control, questioning the janitor aggressively. He asked why the man hadn't come forward sooner, why he hadn't reported the incident immediately. The janitor answered calmly, explaining that he had been intimidated by the company and worried for his own job. He said he had seen injustice before, and had learned that speaking up often came with a heavy price. But seeing David accused of something he didn't do finally gave him the courage to act. David watched the man speak and felt a surge of gratitude. He had been invisible for so long, overlooked and underestimated, and yet here was someone willing to risk everything to tell the truth. It reminded him of the people he had always tried to help quietly, the neighbors he had fixed doors for without asking for anything, the children he had tutored in his free time. Good people often went unnoticed, but sometimes, just sometimes, the truth could shine through. The manager who accused him now sat frozen. He hadn't expected anyone to come forward. He had thought the accusation would be enough to ruin David, that the town's perception of him would carry the day. But the tide was turning. David could feel it in the air. People were starting to question the story they had accepted so easily before. As the day wore on, more witnesses came forward. Some had been afraid of speaking out. Others had assumed David was guilty like everyone else. But now, emboldened by the janitor's courage, they shared what they had seen. Each story added a piece to the puzzle, slowly painting a picture of innocence rather than guilt. David felt a strange mixture of relief and exhaustion. He wanted to stand and hug each person who spoke in his favor, but he stayed seated, letting Rachel guide the case. He had learned over the years that courage came in many forms. Sometimes it was showing up every day to work, and sometimes it was telling the truth even when it scared you. By the end of the day, the courtroom felt different. The whispers among the audience were no longer about a man who had supposedly stolen, but about the evidence, the witnesses, and the questions that still hung in the air. The prosecutor's confident demeanor had faltered, and even the judge seemed to sense that something important was happening. David left the courtroom that evening with his children by his side. They walked slowly, savoring the cool evening air. For the first time in weeks, David felt a small sense of hope. The tears he had shed yesterday hadn't been wasted. They had shown the human side of him to everyone who had watched, and now that humanity was being recognized. At home, he sat quietly for a long time, thinking about the day. He thought about the janitor, the neighbors who had spoken up, and his lawyer who never gave up. He thought about his wife and the values she had instilled in him: honesty, patience, and the belief that truth had a way of coming out, even when the world seemed stacked against you. David knew the trial wasn't over and there would be more challenges ahead, but the cracks in the wall of falsehood were growing, and he could feel the light starting to break through. He was tired but not defeated. He had been tested, humiliated, and made to cry in front of strangers, but he still had his dignity, his family, and the knowledge that he had done nothing wrong. That night, he whispered a quiet prayer, not for revenge, but for courage, for himself, for the witnesses who had spoken up, and for everyone who would face injustice in the future. He had cried in court, but tomorrow he would continue to stand, and the story was only just beginning to turn in his favor. The morning sun shone through the tall windows of the courtroom, casting a warm glow on the polished wooden benches. David sat quietly at the defendant's table, his hands resting on his knees. The events of the previous day replayed in his mind: the tears, the fear, the small spark of hope when the janitor had come forward. He felt a mix of nerves and cautious optimism. The truth was finally beginning to surface, but he knew the hardest part wasn't over yet. The courtroom slowly filled again. Some faces from the town were familiar. Others were new. They had heard about the janitor's testimony and the video, and the curiosity in the room was almost palpable. The air was heavy with anticipation. David's children took their usual seats behind him, their expressions serious but supportive. David tried to focus on them, drawing strength from their quiet faith in him. Rachel, his lawyer, had prepared a few more witnesses. Each one had seen or known something about the night the tools went missing. Rachel had spoken to them for weeks, encouraging them to come forward, assuring them that the truth mattered more than anything else. Now, one by one, they were ready to speak in court. The first witness of the day was an older construction worker named Thomas. He had been at the company longer than anyone else except the manager. He had seen many things, both fair and unfair, but he had never interfered. Today, however, he felt he had to. He explained how he had seen the manager acting suspiciously near the storage room on the night in question. He described the manager's nervous glances, the way he had hurriedly opened and closed a locker, and how he had quickly left when he thought no one was watching. The jury listened closely. Some exchanged looks, whispering quietly among themselves. Thomas's words were simple, but the effect was powerful. He had described the manager's behavior without accusation, just the facts. David felt a small surge of relief, a feeling he hadn't allowed himself in days. Next came a young woman named Lily, a temporary employee who had been working late that same night. She had been scared to speak up before because she feared losing her job. But after seeing Thomas testify, she finally felt safe. She said she had seen the manager carrying a small box toward David's locker, and she thought it strange at the time. She hadn't realized the importance of what she had seen until now. Her voice trembled as she spoke, but her honesty shone through. The jury leaned forward, some nodding slightly. David's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to stand and hug her, to thank her for risking her job and speaking the truth. Instead, he sat still, letting the words sink in. Rachel took the opportunity to ask her questions, carefully guiding the witnesses to tell the story clearly. She asked who had access to the storage room, who had keys, and whether anyone else could have been responsible for placing the tools in David's locker. The witnesses all confirmed that the manager had unique access and had been acting suspiciously that night. The prosecutor grew tense. His confident demeanor from the previous days had started to crack. He objected to some questions, but the judge allowed most of them, sensing the importance of these testimonies. The room felt electric with tension, a delicate balance between accusation and revelation. David tried to calm his racing mind. He remembered sitting at his kitchen table the night before, staring at his wife's photograph, wondering how life could turn so cruelly against him. But now, with these witnesses speaking the truth, he felt the tide slowly turning. He had cried in court, yes, but those tears had been a release, a way to show that he was human, vulnerable, and yet strong enough to endure. After Lily, another witness stepped forward, an office assistant named Harold. He had been hesitant at first, worried about the repercussions, but he too had seen the manager acting strangely. He had noticed that the manager was the only one who seemed to know exactly when the tools would be checked, and he had been overly interested in David's locker. Harold admitted that he had been intimidated by the manager for years, but seeing David accused unjustly gave him courage. As the testimonies continued, the pattern became clear. Multiple witnesses had independently seen the manager near the storage room that night, acting nervously and handling items in ways that didn't make sense. The jury began to exchange looks, whispering quietly to each other. The prosecution's case was weakening. David sat quietly, listening to each story. Each word was a lifeline, pulling him closer to the possibility of justice. His thoughts drifted to his children. He wanted them to grow up knowing that truth mattered, that courage mattered, and that sometimes standing up for what was right could feel terrifying, but ultimately made a difference. Then, the janitor who had first come forward took the stand again. This time, he provided more details about the small video he had captured on his old phone. He described how he had seen the manager slip an item into David's locker and how the manager had left without anyone noticing. The judge asked to view the video again, and this time the jury could see more clearly the figure's movements and the way he handled the items. David felt his chest tighten as the images played. The person moving toward the locker was unmistakably the manager. The jury's expressions changed from curiosity to concern. Even the prosecutor looked uneasy, adjusting his tie and glancing nervously at the evidence. Rachel asked David to remain calm as she guided the witnesses through their statements. She emphasized the facts without adding emotion, allowing the truth to speak for itself. The courtroom listened, hanging on every word. The tension was thick, but it was a different kind of tension now, one filled with anticipation of justice rather than fear of punishment. David's children watched him closely, their faces softening as they saw hope return to their father's eyes. His son whispered that he was proud of him, and his daughter nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. David felt a warmth in his chest that he hadn't felt in weeks. He realized that even in the darkest moments there were people who could shine light, people who would risk everything to stand for truth. The manager, meanwhile, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His smug expression from the first day was gone, replaced with a tight-lipped frown. He avoided eye contact with the jury and occasionally muttered under his breath. David could see the tension radiating off him. He had underestimated the courage of the witnesses and the strength of the truth. As the day progressed, Rachel introduced new evidence, time logs, security records, and notes that contradicted the manager's story. Each piece was simple on its own, but together they created a picture that made the manager's claims impossible to believe. The jury looked increasingly convinced that David had been wrongly accused. David tried to remain composed. He had cried in court, yes, but now he felt something stronger, a quiet determination. He would not let fear or injustice define him. The support of the witnesses, the dedication of his lawyer, and the presence of his children gave him courage he hadn't realized he still had. Near the end of the day, a surprising twist occurred. One of the company's security guards, who had been reluctant to speak earlier, was called to testify. He revealed that he had noticed unusual activity in the storage area that night and had seen the manager leaving quickly with a box of items. He hadn't reported it at the time because he feared losing his job, but seeing David in court changed everything. The courtroom erupted quietly, murmurs spreading through the audience. The evidence was stacking up, and the story of David's innocence was becoming undeniable. Even the judge seemed to take notice, leaning forward slightly, his eyes focused intently on the proceedings. David felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. Relief that the truth was finally emerging, and exhaustion from the weight of the past days, the shame, the fear, and the tears. But above all, he felt hope. Hope that justice would prevail. Hope that his children would see fairness in action. Hope that the town would recognize the courage of ordinary people speaking up for what was right. As the court adjourned for the day, David walked slowly out of the courtroom with his children by his side. The cool evening air felt like a balm on his tired skin. People on the street who had once whispered behind his back now gave quiet nods or avoided eye contact, unsure how to respond to the turning tide. David reflected on the day as he sat at home that night. He thought about the janitor, the witnesses, his lawyer, and even the hesitant security guard. Each had shown courage in a small way, but together they had created a powerful force that even the strongest lies could not withstand. He realized that justice wasn't always immediate, and truth didn't always arrive on its own, but when people were willing to stand for it, it could be unstoppable. He looked at his children, sleeping peacefully in the next room, and felt a renewed sense of purpose. The trial wasn't over, but the momentum had shifted. The tears he had shed were no longer a symbol of defeat, but a reminder of his humanity and resilience. He had been pushed to the brink, and now he was rising again. David knew the next days would be critical. There would be more witnesses, more evidence, and perhaps more attempts to undermine the truth, but he felt ready. He had the support of people who believed in him, and most importantly, he knew his own heart. He had done nothing wrong, and now the world was beginning to see that fact. That night he whispered a quiet promise to himself. No matter what happened next, he would continue to stand for the truth. The next day, the courtroom was tense from the moment it opened. Everyone who had been following the trial could feel that something was about to shift. David sat quietly at the defendant's table, his hands clasped tightly together. The past days had been exhausting, both emotionally and physically, but he was determined to stay focused. He knew the truth was beginning to surface, and he felt the fragile hope he had been holding on to grow stronger. Rachel, his lawyer, had prepared carefully. She knew the evidence was leaning in their favor, but she also knew the prosecutor would fight fiercely to hold on to the story he had been building for days. David took a deep breath as the judge called the court to order. The sound of the gavel echoed through the room, and everyone rose briefly before sitting again. The prosecutor began the day by presenting more documents, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried before. Each piece of evidence seemed less convincing now that witnesses had begun pointing to the manager's suspicious behavior. David noticed a few jurors whispering to each other, nodding subtly. It was clear they were starting to question the narrative they had been presented with. Rachel requested to bring forward a new witness, someone who had been reluctant to speak in the earlier days. The judge allowed it. The man who entered was an older technician who maintained the company's inventory records. He looked nervous, hands shaking slightly as he approached the stand. David could see the fear in his eyes, but also a determination to tell the truth. The technician explained how the inventory system worked and how he had noticed discrepancies in the records. The numbers didn't match what the manager had reported. He hesitated for a moment before continuing, saying he had feared repercussions if he spoke up earlier. Now, seeing David wrongly accused, he could no longer remain silent. He described specific entries and movements that pointed to the manager manipulating the records. The courtroom was silent as the jurors leaned in, trying to understand the details. David felt a rush of relief. Every witness who had come forward added another layer of clarity, slowly unraveling the story that had been falsely constructed against him. He remembered the countless nights he had spent working late, fixing problems at the company, and how those same actions had been twisted into evidence of guilt. Now the truth was finally emerging piece by piece. Rachel guided the witness carefully, asking him to explain everything in simple terms so that the jury could follow without confusion. She emphasized that the evidence wasn't just a matter of opinion, it was documented, recorded, and verifiable. David could feel the tension in the room shift. It was no longer just about him defending himself. It was about exposing the truth, and people were starting to see it clearly. The manager who had accused David sat stiffly, avoiding eye contact. His face had lost its earlier smugness, replaced by a tense, worried expression. Every piece of testimony chipped away at the credibility he had tried to build. David could sense his growing fear, but he didn't feel anger. He only felt the quiet satisfaction that comes when justice begins to take its proper course. Rachel then introduced another critical piece of evidence, a log from the company's security cameras. The footage clearly showed the manager moving items in and out of lockers, manipulating the very tools that had been used to accuse David. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable at first, but when the court played it in slow motion, the actions became undeniable. The jurors leaned forward, whispering among themselves, their expressions a mix of shock and disbelief. David's hands were no longer trembling. His heart was racing, but this time it was from relief, not fear. The tears he had shed in the courtroom days ago felt like a distant memory, replaced by a sense of vindication. The people who had doubted him now had to confront the evidence with their own eyes. He realized that the truth, when given the chance, was powerful and unstoppable. The prosecutor attempted to object, saying the footage was unclear and could not definitively identify the manager. But the judge allowed it, noting that the combined weight of the witnesses' testimonies and the supporting evidence made it relevant. The courtroom watched in tense silence as the video played again, each second making it more obvious that the manager had been trying to frame David. David's children sat behind him, holding hands quietly. Their faces reflected a mix of astonishment and relief. For weeks they had been living under the shadow of fear, worried for their father and the future of their family. Now, as the evidence mounted, they began to feel that justice was finally within reach. David glanced at them and felt a surge of gratitude for their support and patience. Rachel then turned her attention to the jury, summarizing the evidence in simple, clear language. She highlighted the witnesses who had seen the manager acting suspiciously, the security footage, and the discrepancies in the records. She emphasized that David had spent his life working honestly and had been falsely accused. Her words were calm but powerful, allowing the truth to speak louder than any argument. The jurors listened intently. Some nodded subtly, others whispered to each other. The atmosphere in the courtroom had changed completely. Where there had been doubt and uncertainty, now there was a sense of clarity. The story of a hard-working man being unfairly accused was becoming undeniable. The manager shifted in his seat again, now visibly sweating. His confident demeanor had completely vanished. He realized that the walls he had built with lies and manipulation were crumbling around him. Every witness, every piece of evidence, and every testimony was revealing the truth that he had tried so hard to hide. At one point, the judge paused the proceedings to address the manager directly. He reminded him of the seriousness of presenting false evidence and the potential consequences of obstructing justice. The manager's face paled and he remained silent, his eyes cast downward. David felt a quiet sense of justice settling over the room. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was undeniable. Rachel then called one final witness for the day, a former employee who had left the company months earlier. This person had seen the manager moving items and heard conversations that indicated a plan to frame David. The testimony was clear and concise, adding the final piece to the puzzle. The jurors leaned forward, taking notes, and some exchanged looks of disbelief. David sat quietly, absorbing everything. The tears he had shed days before felt like a distant memory, but the emotions behind them were still alive. He had been crushed by fear, humiliation, and injustice, but now he felt a profound sense of relief. The truth was winning, and he could finally breathe. The courtroom adjourned for the day, and David walked out with his children by his side. The air outside felt crisp and freeing. People on the street who had once whispered behind their hands now looked at him with respect, some offering quiet nods. David felt the weight of the past week slowly lifting from his shoulders. At home that night, he reflected on the events of the day. He thought about the witnesses who had come forward, risking their own comfort and security to tell the truth. He thought about Rachel, who had tirelessly pursued justice even when the odds seemed stacked against them. And he thought about his children, whose quiet faith had given him strength when he felt most alone. David realized that justice wasn't just about punishment or revenge. It was about truth, integrity, and the courage to stand for what was right, even when the world seemed against you. The tears he had shed in court were not a sign of weakness, but a testament to the human spirit and the pain of being wronged. He knew the trial wasn't completely over, but the momentum had shifted decisively. The false narrative that had threatened to destroy his life was collapsing under the weight of honesty, courage, and evidence. David felt a quiet confidence that the next steps would finally bring him the justice he deserved. That night, he whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude not just for himself, but for the people who had made it possible for the truth to come out. The janitor, the witnesses, his lawyer, and even the hesitant security guard had all played a role. Without them, he would still be trapped in a nightmare of false accusations. David went to bed that night with a sense of calm he hadn't felt in weeks. The tears in the courtroom had been a beginning, a release, and now they had transformed into determination and hope. The story was nearing its conclusion, and the moment that would change everything was coming closer with each passing day. Tomorrow, he thought, would be the day that the truth fully revealed itself, and the man who had tried to destroy his life would face the consequences. For the first time in a long while, David felt ready, not just to defend himself, but to witness justice finally being served.